Hi, welcome to Up Your Nerd Cred. Did you used to know everything that was happening in the Marvel and DC universes? Did finding out that some superheroes are from Marvel and some are from DC blow your mind? Has keeping track of everything that's happening there, and then realizing we're only talking about the comics universes and the cinematic universes. They all have their own multiversal crises that have gotten a little bit out of hand? Well, don't worry. Up Your Nerd Cred is here to talk about the gods cosplaying as men, the men cosplaying as gods, and how much the cinematic universes are really leaving out. At the end of each episode, you'll hopefully know a little bit more than you did and can up your nerd cred. I'm your casual nerd host, CC. I hope you all have had a lovely week with whatever religious practice you have or don't have. The important part of the holiday is that there are half-price jelly beans for the next 3 days. That's what's important to me. Okay, actually, no. I'm more excited about other things than jelly beans, although I am pretty hyped about the jelly beans. You will notice that our intrepid co-host is actually out this week because he's actually trying to get a lot of blue paint out of places that it's probably not supposed to have ended up at WonderCon. So for now, it's just me and the nerdy background information that you'll need for whenever it is that he's coming and talking to us in the future. This will make sense soon. Anyway, I do want to make sure that we are clear that just because we are clarifying the format, right, does not mean that we are going to skip out on the format altogether, right? Of course, right. So, podcast listeners, what are we nerding out about this week? As a reminder, of course, you can nerd out about all kinds of things, okay? It doesn't have to just be heroes and villains. Pam Bondi has probably had a really rough Easter. The videos of the Artemis 2 lander have given me goosebumps every time. And striking amount of social media is on death watch for the president again because he's been missing for 3 days. And I'm not sure that the president being missing for a couple of days at a time is supposed to be something that is part of a functioning society. But, all right, things happen. So, what am I nerding out about? Well, like I said, it was the Passover and Easter kind of mashup this week. And so I've actually had a tradition since before I was officially Jewish. It's the Prince of Egypt, all right? That movie is my jam, and I cannot think of the last time that I've actually made it through Deliver Us without a tear in my eye or a bunch of tears in my eyes, okay? That song always makes me cry, right? But now, I love that movie. Love it down. Especially the disclaimer that they put at the beginning of it on just like, hey, this story is high-key important to a lot of people. I would say low-key, but no, high-key important to a lot of people. And we did the best that we could to make sure that it was as accurate to all the traditions as possible, right? And it's like, great. But they had this whole movie about Jewish people, and Jeff Goldblum was probably the only cast member who'd actually had a Seder when he was a kid, right? Like, okay, I get it. The sheer star power behind the movie is part of the reason that it became the cultural phenomenon that it is, right? But it is kind of funky with a 2026 eye, though, right? Like, we see that? Yeah. Having said that, Mariah and Whitney's version of When You Believe continues to be a classic, and I'm going to go ahead and actually go listen to that on repeat real fast. So let me go and ball to it a little and then fix my face, and I'll be back to up your nerd cred. Welcome back. Yes, listeners, I would like for us to start on a bit of a journey to figure out a little bit more about conventions and things of that nature, because our podcast listener, because I'll remind you again, our podcast co-host is at WonderCon, and he is frequently at a lot of the other cons that happen all around California. and not even just California. And so I think that it is a good idea for us to sit there and take some time to talk a little bit about what the whole con experience is. And then actually, when he gets back, we can sit there and get deep into what the con experience is on the deep level, right? All right. So we're going to go on the academic thing and just try to kind of figure out what actually is a fan convention, right? Like, what is it that we're talking about whenever we say, like, somebody's going to a con, right? So generally speaking, it's a structured gathering of people, right? There's a shared interest. Usually, like, when you're thinking of it, you're thinking of comics, you're thinking of sci-fi, you're thinking of gaming. Now, the broader pop culture of it all has been brought into things, but there are cons for everything, okay? There are cons for knitting. There are cons for very specific book series, okay? There are cons for just about anything that you can think of. If you get a bunch of people who are interested in a certain specific thing, they're going to a certain extent, gather and hang out with other people who are interested in that same specific thing. Cons in general tend to be like, they're really like community driven, right? Like there is a very huge profit motivator that happens with cons now, but to a certain extent, as they all started out, it's, it's all about the community, like getting together with a whole bunch of people who like the same thing that you do and talking about them. The same way that people try to like make jokes about how like, oh, nerds don't really talk to each other about things or thinking about like the jokes for people. It's like nerds don't really talk. They just kind of sit there and say, well, actually, but yeah, you get a whole bunch of nerds together who all have a common interest, give them an opportunity to actually each other. It's going to be a delight for everybody involved, okay? And the fan aspect, being a fan of something is really like part of what leads to the convention structure in general, right? Like, yes, there is going to be an infrastructure that is going to develop later on as like we have like, scale and things like that. But it's worth noting the fact too that having a bunch of people who want to come together and talk about things, to want to learn more about something that they're really interested in, it's very cool, right? It's something that is not is something that is in many ways taken for granted in 2026 because of the fact that con culture has become as ubiquitous as it is, right? So let's cycle back a little bit, right? And when I say a little bit, I mean not quite 100 years, but let's go back to like the late 1930s and 90s, right? So we have the golden age of comics, right? We are in a place where like all of the good comics have widespread cultural reach, okay? Superheroes aren't necessarily something that was considered niche to a certain extent. They were pretty mainstream, and let's be honest, they were absolutely propaganda, okay? As we're in the middle of fighting a number of wars and such, trying to demonstrate that we are kind of the best, okay? American exceptionalism is a problem. It's a large part of the reason why there are a number of things that were happening in the Golden Age, but that's not what we're talking about, okay? What we're talking about is the fact that we used to punch Nazis like a respectable country, okay? But the demand for comics overall, it was pretty high at this point in time, right? Like, again, very popular situation. But a lot of the comics distributions was through like newsstands and such, right? You're not really having the specialty comics shops or whatever, right? And if you have been in any major city, you've been to the newsstand where like you can pick up all kinds of things. You can pick up 3 different newspapers. You can pick up your Red Bull or your coffee or whatever else, like, all the different little like shops or whatever. Newsstands, that's at the time, that's where the best places to pick up the comics were. If you want to get a image of that kind of thing, go look in the Watchmen comics and you will see the sort of vignettes where they're talking about like the whole like Black Pirates, Black Flag thing within the Watchmen comics strips. There is a boy who's actually like hanging out at the newsstands who's trying to read the things without necessarily paying for it. That's the kind of things that were happening back in the day. But with that whole thing with comics, like There's not really any kind of specialty shops with it. It's not really something that is a specific fandom. Is viewed as more diffuse throughout the entire country, right? So the infrastructure for like the sustained fandom hadn't really been built yet, but it was starting to get there. Because let's be honest, the fact that there weren't comic shops in the 1940s and the fact that comic shops have become the go-to image for where nerds congregate is there for a reason, right? Of course, right. Now, as a reminder, we have already talked about how there's been like a shift in, the popularity of comics throughout the ages, right? So there was the drop off in the fandom that we had in the Silver Age, right? So, yes, there are still newsstands that have comics and things that are out there, but again, we have like the shift towards cowboys and horror. Comics are honestly starting to compete with television and film overall for audience attention because, you know, there's a lot of things that are happening where people can look at it. And whereas comics had been a visual medium when in the age of radio, by the time TV and film comes along, we're going to have like, a few more things that are going to compete for your visual attention. So to a certain extent, the industry was able to adapt. But the fandom, which was already pretty diffused in the sense of just being different newspaper places or newsstands that would have like more people who would pick up comics than others, it's a little bit less centralized as it becomes a little bit less supported by the sort of powers that be. So, with that, fans had to figure out alternate ways to make sure that they were able to really connect with other fans and kind of develop the interest that they were having in the specific comics and things of that nature. So there are a lot of things that they would do in this time frame, which again, I cannot stress enough, podcast listeners. This is in the time long before internet is even a twinkle in internet's granddaddy's eye, okay? Long before that. So like comics are sitting there really working and getting their developed and concentrated fan bases because of things like zines and meetups and honestly connecting in hotel ballrooms or even somebody's like garage or whatever, right? Like there are a lot of ways that fans are able to reach out to other fans and, form early communication networks. Again, in a pre-internet infrastructure, right? You would have your mailing lists, you'd have your pen pals, you would have your word of mouth, and you would build networks of fans in different nodes and stuff where you would be able to sit there and build and have other people who are interested in what it is that you were interested in. And a lot of this was able to help and like, kind of keep the fandom going through to the Bronze Age, right? Keep things going and make sure that we were able to actually get to the Bronze Age. A lot of the underground comics and things were really, really critical in making sure that nerd culture kept going. But after a while, you're going to get to a point where you have meetups of a certain size, right? You can't necessarily just keep people in your basement. You can't necessarily keep people in like a church hall or in, whatever lodge lets you borrow their space for the weekend, right? At a certain point, you're going to have like a growth in network and it's going to lead to a real shift in the ability for you to manage things without putting together structure for these gatherings, right? So, sure, we had a number of informal meetups. We had a number of groups who were getting together and talking about things that they liked, the comics that they liked, let's be honest. The sci-fi that they liked in other places. Let's not put it all. We're trying to get together and have a whole bunch of conversations about things that we like, okay? Basically, this is all the autistics getting together and having a moment before there were train conversations. I don't know. Yeah. So, what do we have? We eventually got to a point where we had to have conventions, right? Now, we did have a bunch of conventions that started over the course of time that have been important within the history of the con, right? So we have WorldCon in 1939, and that is the first science fiction focused convention, right? So this is in 1939, this is a whole bunch of people coming together and saying, I really like sci-fi and I want to hang out and talk about sci-fi with other sci-fi people, right? And so we keep going, and we have, another really like solid con that New York Comic Con in 1964. And that one's like, very specifically focused on being a comic book convention. And I will highlight that the one that we're talking about in 1964 is technically a one-off, okay? So the NYCC that you're expecting me to talk about, that one didn't start until 2006. I promise you we will get to it. We were talking about, though, just early conventions, 1939, 1964. I would like to highlight the fact that it is very, very difficult to be able to pull off these kinds of things. Again, when you've got mailing lists and you've got very, very solid small groups of people that you're able to work with to be able to pull this kind of thing off. I kind of tip my hat to the folks who are able to pull this off. I'm not gonna lie. The early conventions, though, have kind of established a bit of a baseline structure, right? So they have scheduled programming, they have guest speakers, they have fan interactions, and there's a lot of it where the fandom is able to sustain itself ultimately despite the fluctuations of industry, right? The fickleness of whether or not we are able to get shops to consistently hold Superman and Batman, whatever other comics that we're looking at, by being able to gather in groups and discuss things and swap things and get talent to be able to come and see that we're interested in it. Honestly, I can see it as like as a whole vibe, right? In most cases, the casual podcast listener is going to be familiar with probably San Diego Comic-Con. If there's any Comic-Con that you know about, it's gonna be San Diego. Honestly, you probably aren't actually necessarily even aware of the San Diego part of it. It is just Comic-Con. It is the convention that even the most casualist of nerds have heard of. Why? Why is this con like so big, right? So let's cycle back a little bit, right? So there's a certain amount of it where studios are starting to get into nerd culture, right? And that's how it is that we move from cons being something that is a small group of people who are coming together and being like, I'm super into this thing, to it exploding into something that is honestly what it is that we think about as a con today, okay? So, look, there are a lot of things about it that, yes, the larger studios paying attention to it is a huge money grab, and we will talk about that in a moment. But one of the big perks about it is the fact that if you are able to have a major convention and get people from all over the country, all over the world, however far you're able to get people to come over from, right? It's the original targeted marketing, okay? Think about it. San Diego Comic-Con, we'll use that one as an example, right? So it started out as San Diego Golden State Comic Mini-Con in 1970, right? The first mini-con had about 65 people who attended, and the mini-con was used to, in many ways, help fund the actual official San Diego Golden State, Comic-Con, right? And so that con had about 300 people. Now, if you think about San Diego Comic-Con overall, the fact that the 1970 thing had 300 people all together, whereas San Diego Comic-Con 2026 is going to have rooms where there are more than 300 people just in a singular room for a singular thing. It's really grown into something that is unmistakable, and it is a great way for the studios, for the artists, for people who are interested in nerd culture, the people who this is their bread and butter, and also like this is what it is that they do. Being able to have a con is amazing because you have a high engagement audience. And to a certain extent, the kind of people who are able to pay to go to cons probably have a bit of disposable income that other people don't. So it becomes much more of a marketing, idea. It becomes much more of a marketing brilliant idea to take advantage of the cons to make sure that everybody is getting an opportunity to feel very special about your brand develop warm and fuzzy feelings about that. So, how is it that we're able to do this? Well, to a certain extent, you have what I would like to think about, or you have what I would like to describe as the Hall H kind of vibes, right? So now what is Hall H? Hall H at San Diego Comic-Con, that's where all of like the really big announcements are. That's where you have the people who are coming together from like, this it becomes a whole media event. This is where you have people who whenever you have the new designs about what's happening with the various Marvel phases and stuff like that, as soon as San Diego Comic-Con is happening and somebody's in that room, somebody is releasing the cell phone video footage of it because being in that room gives you an opportunity to actually be one of the first people to find out about all kinds of things. So studios take advantage of that fact to make sure that they have like their large scale announcements for a lot of things. I think that we all remember when there was the whole Doombots that were wandering around, and then Robert Downey Jr. popped off his hat, and we found out that Dr. Doom was going to be Robert Downey Jr., right? Yeah. Trailer premieres, exclusive content. There are so many things that happen at these big conventions, right? And the audience reaction is like, part of the marketing strategies because again, the whole videos of just like we're all finding out about Robert Downey Jr. becoming Dr. Doom at the same time because he's popping his mask off at this thing. But you were actually there in the room with Robert Downey Jr. as he's doing this. This is giving you a whole opportunity to be in a place of, you are not only are you getting past the general FOMO of finding out about things after other people, but cons have a lot of self-selecting things that are going on to make them very much like you are asking to be in a targeted marketing environment, right? So they have con exclusives, right? They have, again, like the whole FOMO kind of thing that you can have of just like, hey, if you don't show up to this thing, you're not going to be able to see this new thing that's coming out. You're not going to be able to have this signature. You're not going to be able to attend this panel. There's a lot of things that cons are able to do now to make sure that you know that you need to attend, regardless of the price of them. And it is kind of crazy. And we're going to talk to AM about how sometimes these prices be crazy, which is not me saying that you guys need to get set up with our Patreon, but it is me saying that if you do consider getting a part of our Patreon, I'm just saying blue paint is expensive and Nightcrawler is a very, very complex character that, you know, deserves some attention. Yeah. Anyway, moving on. We have, though, like a lot of things that you can do with like these big cons, right? And what's really great about the fact that we have these big nerd cons that have happened is the fact that paradoxically, we've been able to spin off back into a lot of the smaller cons that we have all over the country. So to a certain extent, when things first started, it was small groups of people. You started in the hotel ballroom. You only had a few bunch of people who were able to come together all at the time. But the fact that we are able to let me put it to you this way, okay? I actually sat there and was double checking, like, okay, I know that con season is like a whole thing, right? But how long does con season actually go? Well, it turns out that you can actually sit there and be going to cons pretty much the entirety of the year, okay? Now, I am given to understand that WonderCon is like, pretty early on in the list of cons for the schedule, and New York Comic Con is, towards the end of the main things. But yeah, you can pretty much attend a regional con at some point throughout the year. Um and I think that that is really, really cool. It is a whole lot of opportunities for example, talent to be able to go to like the smaller cons that are closer to where it is that they live. It is giving the opportunity for people who may not necessarily be able to go all the way to San Diego or New York or anywhere else to be able to go to a regional con and hone their cosplay skills, possibly meet talent that they like. And it is so cool to be able to go and really like live your most wild dreams at a place that is well put together, where people have sat there and taken care of the logistics, where you know for a fact the talent who you are going to be seeing is actually there. And you can kind of guess, podcast listeners, based on how much I'm hitting these beats, that there are a few places that have not quite actually pulled this off. Look, it's really important to note that cons overall, they live and die based upon how much prep work has been done, okay? Right? Like early cons, they're small in nature, right? Again, like I said, the mini con and then the ultimate, like first San Diego con, 300 people, you can manage that as an individual person, right? Cons overall capping out as like maybe a few hundred people early on as an individual, or maybe even a couple of people. That's easy for you to manage early on. But there was a lot of logistical work that was required in the pre-internet era. And I'm not going to lie, the logistical work that is required in the post-internet era has not actually made things that much easier, okay? So like, but let's cycle back to like some of the logistical work for the pre-internet era, right? So you have the mailing lists and things of that nature, and the groups are so fans decided that they wanted to essentially create a reputation of prestige for comic books overall. And so several fans came together and created the Academy of Comic Book Fans and Collectors, the ACBFC. Do not sit there and try to make that into the alphabet. You're just going to confuse yourself, right? But it is the first official organization of like comic book enthusiasts and historians, right? Now, it did last about 10 years, but it did have the first industry awards, the first, comic book industry awards, the Alley Awards. And one of the things that they were able to do is actually establish that comic fandom was something that is regionally con-worthy, that is worth attention. And so to a certain extent, honestly, they became less needed. And so by the time 1970 rolled around, they actually were disbanded. Now, I will tell you that scheduling panels and convention is 100% a multi-person job, okay? Like, scheduling a convention overall is a huge bunch of work. There are whole certifications that people get for running conventions, okay? I know that I am talking about how, like, there's a lot of things that are happening behind the scenes, but let me put it to you this way, okay? One of my past jobs, when I was like in the nonprofit world, is I worked on a educational conference, right? And I spent much of the time in the year leading up to the conference and like putting together the different things that I needed to do to make sure that the conference was a success. And I only had one section of it, but chasing down presenters and making sure that everybody had their information in on time, making sure that people who were supposed to pay for things had paid for things on time. There's so much to it, and I only had a small section of it. Honestly, shout out to the people who are managing your conventions. They are saints. They are really doing so much work, and we really need to put some respect on their names. Now, there's a lot about current con structures that do resemble like a lot of the early design of conventions, right? So you have your hospitality suites, you have your scheduled panels, you have your meet and greets where possible, right? And to a certain extent, honestly, you have a bit of an easier time with it because now we have convention centers that exist to make the work of a lot of con logistics easier, right? Having a convention center means that you have a place that you already know has an adequate number of bathrooms. And so you don't have to hire porta johns because let's be honest, trying to figure out if you have a place to use the restroom in some of these more elaborate cosplays seems very difficult. I've seen Daleks and I'm not sure that I want to try to, not I'm I've seen Dalek cosplay, and I'm not sure that I would want to try to use a porta-john with that one. Anyway, like, let's point out, though, that convention planning and executing is a lot of work and a lot of people are involved, right? So, San Diego Comic-Con. Now, admittedly, this is pretty much like one of like the biggest conventions that we have, but they have 13 board members on the planning committee. They have 16 to 20 full-time and part-time workers, right? And then they have another 80 volunteers who assist via committees. Now, that is based off of the quick Wikipedia check, but let's be honest, there are a lot of people who are making sure that San Diego Comic-Con goes off without a hitch, okay? It is a lot of work. They have a lot of meetings, and I'm pretty sure that none of them want their families to sit there and try to convince them that they need to go on a vacation a couple of weeks before things happen. Not important. So, while it is that we're sitting there and talking about the important work involved with planning things, though, I think we need to talk about the cautionary tales that happen when you do not actually manage your logistics correctly, okay? So, DashCon, they're known for the ball pit, right? Okay, so you're just like, what is DashCon? It's not just a ball pit in a children's wading pool. It was actually technically a very full situation where it was supposed to be a con for Tumblr users, right? So like it's again, you can have cons for all kinds of things. There's a whole bunch of people who have a lot of interest in things, and in theory, it should be able to get a whole bunch of people together to do a whole bunch of exciting things, right? Except for they had vendors who were leaving because the sales were so bad. They had hotels who they had the hotel threaten to actually shut down the entire con because they had not been paid. I don't entirely understand how the organizers were able to miss the fact that they owed people $20,000, but okay, they were able to raise a bunch of money through fundraising things and were able to keep the convention going. But because of the issues with payments and stuff like that, and arranging for who's gonna pay for rooms and stuff like that, talent pulled out. Organizers offered a few different compensatory measures, including an hour in the infamous ball pit. Yeah. So it is international, though. There's a lot of cons that, again, people just choose not to actually sit there and manage the logistics of things like they're supposed to. So let's talk about the Willy Wonka con in Glasgow, right? Now it was unofficial, right? The proper official name for the convention was Willy's Chocolate Experience, right? But let's be honest, it was very quickly infamous for the fuck ups, okay? The AI generated promised experience was way, way, way oversold for what the actuality of it was, okay? So the website itself was full of typos, right? And not like one or two typos throughout the entire website. It was pretty egregious. And yet this organization wanted to charge £35 per person. The pounds to the dollars were not quite 1-to-1. So let's go ahead and convert that to current money, right? So the £35 that they were asking for the event is about $46 in American. Just so that you can have an idea of like how much things cost, right? Okay. All right. So as you're going though to this place, you have honestly the Fire Festival of cons. And that might be insulting to Fire Festival, okay? The one Oompa Loompa who was photographed looking incredibly bored. She's actually become a meme. And based on the Wikipedia comment that I have seen about it, she's pretty sure that her costume came out of an Amazon box like an hour before she was supposed to start. So it wasn't really super well planned out as a convention. So it was actually run by the House of Illuminati. And again, that was as run by Billy Cole. They were the official producers of the, and they have a laundry list of allegedly fraudulent activity that they've allegedly been involved in. And so, the money grab of an unlicensed con seems to be allegedly within their purview. So, yeah. Moving on, though, the important part is that most cons are actually pretty well put together, okay? So, like I said, AM is over at WonderCon and is probably right now scrubbing blue paint out of various spots as we speak. San Diego Comic-Con, right? That is a pretty solid con highlight, although I will note that the official name of said convention is Comic-Con International San Diego. You are going to call it San Diego Comic-Con. I'm going to call it San Diego Comic-Con. AM is probably going to call it San Diego Comic-Con. And we're all going to be happy, okay? But on that note of cons who feel very strongly about the official name, we remind you that NYCC, what is kind of a season close con, they are not New York City Con. They are New York Comic Con, okay? And again, we want to remind you that the first official comic book convention was held in 1964 and was named the New York Comic Con. However, like I said, the New York Comic Con that we know and love now didn't start again until 2006. So, the two things are not the same. Anyway, we're going to take a quick break while I double check how much the tickets are actually for New York Con, and we'll be back for our thrilling conclusion. Welcome back to our thrilling conclusion. So, podcast listeners, I've so far given you a lot of facts and figures and logistical hurdles that generally cons have to take. And a large part of that is because I have attended a few cons, and I'm not gonna lie, I was pretty hyped because the first time that I got to see John Barrowman, I told him that I wanted our meet and greet photo to be a fountain, and he had said nobody had asked him to be a fountain before, and it was great because he actually pulled off the fountain and I looked absolutely ridiculous. That's not important. What is important is the fact that I have only been to a couple of cons, but AM, he has been to a whole bunch. And so instead of just having like kind of the general idea about like what it's like going to cons from me, podcast listeners, I want you to look forward to next week where I'm going to be asking AM all kinds of things about the con experience because he has gone to so many of them. And like I said, he's got blue paint in so many places. Well, we are going to put a pin in finding that out. Let's get historical about a few other things, yeah? So, here's what we can put on our nerd calendars for the upcoming week. So, on April 9th, 1963, we actually have a huge date in Marvel history, right? So, Doctor Strange and the Ancient One, and Nightmare, and Wong, and the Sanctum Sanctorum, and the Dream Dimension, and the Astral Plane, and the Eye of Agamotto, right? All of these things debut in Strange Tales number 110, right? All of these things are debuting, right? So Stan Lee and Steve Ditko are just like, let's make April 9th like a pretty solid day, right? Also, you're just like, oh, okay, that's pretty solid. No, April 9th is also the day that Dr. Octopus makes his first appearance. Snap! What? Also, as we're talking about April 9th, that's the appearance of Gerard Way. So, every millennial who has been summoned by that singular note on the piano, yes, April 9th is also his birthday. Now, I don't want anyone to think that April 9th is the only day that we care about, right? Because April is actually Alfred Pennyworth's birthday. Now, I'm pretty sure that we all know that our Aries King is pretty much able to actually kick so much ass it's not even funny, but he's also able to do it with a smile and bit of a sniff that people actually want to try him. And honestly, I respect that, Alfred. I respect that. So, listeners, we've come to the end of our podcast. I know. How is it over so soon? Well, good news. Our next episode is coming out next week. You're also more than welcome to listen to this episode again if that's not fast enough. Or, of course, you can always join our Patreon, www.patreon.com/upyournerdcredpod, where you can get solo scripts and behind-the-scene footage, things like that. Nerd cred takes time to build, but by doing it with a few thousand of your nearest and dearest, it gets pretty cool, yo. And now is the time to mention that we have an Instagram. We're on Apple, we're on Spotify and YouTube, and of course, we're always working to expand our reach. If you like the episode, make sure you rate, review, and subscribe, especially if you're trying to up your nerd cred. You can follow us on Instagram at UpYourNerdCredPod. If you're looking for me across platforms, I'm at CIRACDAVIS, and my co-host is at AMDiazArt. So please make sure that you yell at him about any kind of continuity errors or show him any of the fan art that you've got, the good kind. If you have a burning question that you would like for us to discuss so that you can up your nerd cred, make sure you like and subscribe and leave a comment. And if we pick your question, we'll shout you out in the discussion. And you should also get your friends to like and subscribe too. And your family members and the coworkers that you trust not to be weird about listening to the same podcast as you. And perhaps, do you have a dermatologist? No. Good night, everybody.